Little Snow White.
Once upon a time, in the middle of winter, when the snowflakes were falling thick and fast, a queen sat working at her palace window, the frame of which was made of fine black ebony. While she was sewing, now and then looking out at the flakes, suddenly she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow. As the drops were so bright, she said to herself,
"Oh, I wish I could have a child, as white as this snow, as red as this blood, and as black as the wood of this frame."
Soon afterward she had a little daughter with a skin as white as snow, and cheeks as red as blood, and with hair as black as ebony, and so she was named Snow White. But when the child was born, the mother died. About a year later the king married another woman who was very beautiful. She was so proud of her beauty, that she could not bear anyone to be prettier than herself. She had a wonderful mirror and she used to go to it and say,
"Tell me, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?"
Then it would reply,
"You are the fairest, Lady Queen."
Then she was contented, for she knew that the mirror spoke the truth. Now little Snow White grew prettier and prettier, and when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as day, and far fairer than the queen herself. One day when the queen asked her mirror,
"Tell me, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?"
it replied,
"Queen, you were the fairest yesterday, but Snow White is fairer than you today."
This answer so frightened the queen that she became yellow and green with envy. From that hour, her heart turned against her, and she hated the little girl. Her envy and jealousy grew every day, until she had no rest day or night. At length she sent for a huntsman and said,
"Take the child away into the forest, I will never look upon her again. You must kill her, and bring me her heart and tongue for a token."
The huntsman consented and took the girl away, but when he drew out his knife to kill her, she began to cry, saying,
"Ah, dear huntsman, gives me my life. I will run into the wild forest and never come home again."
This speech softened the huntsman's heart, and she was so lovely that he had pity on her and said,
"Well, run away then, poor child."
But he thought that the wild beasts would soon eat her up. Still he felt as if a stone had been taken from his heart because her death would not be by his hand. Just at that moment, a young boar came roaring along to the spot, so he caught and killed it and took its tongue and heart to show to the queen. But now the poor little child was left motherless and alone. She was bewildered at the sight of so many trees, and did not know which way to go. Then she began to run over stones and through thorns, and wild beasts roared as she passed them, but they did her no harm. She ran on till her feet would carry her no farther. As it was getting dark, she saw a little house nearby and went in to rest. In this cottage everything was very small but very pretty and clean. In the middle stood a little table with a white cloth over it, and there were 7 little plates upon it, each plate having a spoon and a knife and a fork, and there were also 7 little cups. By the wall were 7 little beds side by side, each covered with a clean white quilt. Little Snow White, being both hungry and thirsty, ate from each plate a little bit of bread and meat, and drank a drop of wine out of each cup, for she did not wish to take away the whole share of anyone. After that, she was so tired that she lay down on one bed. But it did not suit, she tried another, but that was too long, a fourth was too short, a fifth too hard, but at last the 7th was quite right, so she lay down upon it, and went to sleep, saying her prayers to God. When it became quite dark, the masters of the cottage came home. They were 7 dwarfs who lived in the mountains and dug underground to search for gold and silver. When they had lighted 7 little lamps and it was light in the whole house, they found that somebody had been in, for everything was not in the order in which they had left it. The first dwarf asked,
"Who has been sitting in my little chair?"
The second,
Who has been eating off my little plate?
the third,
Who has been nibbling at my bread?
the fourth,
Who has been at my meat?
the fifth,
Who has been meddling with my fork?
the sixth grumbled out,
"Who has been cutting with my knife?"
the seventh said,
Who has been drinking out of my cup?
then the first looking round began again.
"Who has been lying in my bed?"
He asked, for he saw that the sheets were tumbled. At these words the others came and looking at their beds cried out running.
Someone has been lying in our beds too.
But the seventh running up to his bed saw a beautiful girl sleeping in it. He called his companions who cried out with wonder brought their 7 lamps to throw light upon little Snow White.
Good heavens!
They cried.
What a lovely girl she is!
They were so much delighted that they did not awaken her, but let her sleep on. And the 7th dwarf slept with his comrades, 1 hour at a time with each, and so passed the night. When morning came and Snow White awoke and saw the 7 little men, she was quite frightened. But they were very friendly and asked her what her name was.
My name is Snow White, was her reply.
"Why have you entered our cottage?"
they asked. Then she told them how her stepmother had ordered her to be killed, how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had wandered about the whole day long until at last she had found their house. Then when her tale was finished, the dwarfs said,
Will you keep our house, be our cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit for us, and keep all things in order? If so, you may stay with us and we'll take good care of you.
Yes, with all my heart,
answered Snow White. And so she stayed and kept their house in good order. In the morning the dwarfs went into the mountains to seek for gold and silver, and in the evening they came home and found their supper ready for them. During the day the maiden was left alone, so the good dwarfs warned her, saying,
Be careful of your stepmother. She will soon know that you are here, so let no one into the cottage.
The queen meanwhile, supposing Snow White was dead, believed that she was the most beautiful lady in the land. One day she went to her mirror and said,
Tell me, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?
And it replied,
Queen, you were the fairest yesterday, but Snow White is fairer than you today. In the forest, darkly green, she lives with dwarfs, 7 hills between.
This reply frightened her, for she knew that the mirror spoke the truth, and she found that the huntsman had deceived her, and that Snow White must still be alive. Now she thought and thought how she could make an end of her, for she could not bear to think that anyone lived who was more beautiful than she was. At last a thought came to her, and she painted her face and clothed herself as a peddler woman, so that no one could know her. In this disguise, she went over the 7 hills to the 7 dwarfs, knocked at the door of the hut and called out,
Fine goods for sale, beautiful goods for sale.
Snow White looked out of the window, and said,
Good day, good woman, what have you to sell?
Fine goods, beautiful goods.
She replied,
Laces of all colors.
and she held up a piece which was woven out of many-colored silk.
I may let in this good woman,
thought Snow White, and she unbolted the door and bought the pretty lace.
You can't think, my dear, how it becomes you.
Exclaimed the old woman.
Come, let me lace it up for you.
Snow White, suspecting nothing, led her with the new lace, but the old woman did so quickly and so tightly that all her breath went, and she fell down like one dead.
"Now,"
said the old woman to herself, hastening away.
"now, I am again the most beautiful in the land."
Not long after her departure, towards evening, the 7 dwarfs came home, and were much frightened at seeing their dear little girl lying on the ground, neither moving nor breathing, as if she were dead. They raised her up, and when they saw how tightly the lace was drawn, they cut it in pieces. Soon she began to breathe again, and little by little she came back to life. When the dwarfs heard what had taken place, they said,
"The old peddler woman was no other than your wicked queen. Be more careful, and let no one enter when we are not here."
The old queen, as soon as she got home, went to her mirror and said as usual,
"Tell me, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?"
And it replied as before,
Queen, you were the fairest yesterday, but Snow White is fairer than you today. In the forest, darkly green, she lives with dwarfs 7 hills between.
When she heard this she was so frightened that the blood flew to her head, for she knew that Snow White was still alive.
"But now, I must think of something which will kill her completely,"
thought she to herself. And she made a poisoned comb by using her magic skill and dressed herself up to look like a quite different woman. She went over the 7 hills to the house of the 7 dwarfs, and, knocking at the door, called out,
"Nice things to sell today."
Snow White looked out, and said, Go
away, I must not let anybody in."
"Only look at my beautiful combs,"
said the old woman, taking out her poisoned comb and holding it up. It pleased the little girl so much that she opened the door. As soon as she bought it, the old woman said,
"Now let me comb your hair with it,"
and Snow White consented. But as soon as the comb ran through the hair, the poison began to work, and the maiden soon fell down senseless.
"My beautiful girl,"
cried the wicked queen.
"it is now all over with you."
And so saying, she went away. Fortunately, it was now near evening, and the 7 dwarfs returned. As soon as they saw Snow White lying as if dead upon the ground, they thought at once it had been done by the old queen. They looked round and soon found the poisoned comb. They soon drew it out of her hair, and Snow White very soon came to herself and told them all that had happened. Then they warned her once more not to open the door to anybody. Meanwhile, the queen, as soon as she came home, consulted her mirror, and when she received the very same answer as before, she trembled and shook with anger. She cried,
"Snow White shall die, though it should cost me my life."
And then she went into an inner secret room where no one could enter, and there made an apple of the strongest poison. The outside of it looked rosy and tempting, but whoever ate even a little bit of it was sure to die. As soon as the apple was ready, the old queen again painted her face and clothed herself like a peasant woman, and then went over the 7 hills to the 7 dwarfs. She knocked at the door, and Snow White stretched out her head, and said,
"I dare not let anybody in. The 7 dwarfs have told me not to."
The old woman said,
"That is hard on me, for I must take back my apples, but here is one which I will give you."
"No, no, I dare not take it,"
answered Snow White.
"What are you afraid of it?"
cried the old woman.
"There, see, I will cut the apple in halves. You eat the red side and I will eat the white side."
Now the apple was so made up that the red side alone was poisoned. Snow White very much wished for the beautiful apple, and when she saw the woman eating a piece of it, She could no longer wait, but, stretching out her hand, took the poisoned half. As soon as she put the piece in her mouth, she fell down dead upon the ground. Then the queen, looking at her with glittering eyes, laughed aloud and cried,
"White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony. This time the dwarfs cannot bring you to life again."
when she came home and asked her mirror,
"Tell me, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?"
it answered.
You are the fairest, Lady Queen.
Then her envious heart was set at rest, as much as an envious heart can ever rest. When the little dwarfs returned home in the evening, they found Snow White lying on the ground, and they were afraid that she was really dead. They lifted her up, and searched if they could find anything poisonous, cut her laces, and combed her hair, and washed her with water and with wine. But all was in vain. The dear child seemed really dead. Then they laid her upon a bier, and sat around it, and wept 3 whole days. Then they thought they must bury her, but she looked still fresh and lifelike, and her cheeks were still rosy. So they said to one another,
"We cannot bury her in the ground."
and they ordered a case to be made of clear glass so that they could see the body from every side, and the dwarfs wrote her name in golden letters upon the glass, saying that she was a king's daughter. Now they placed the glass case upon a rock, and one of them always remained by it to watch. Even the birds came too, and expressed sorrow for the loss of Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and last of all a dove. For a long time Snow White lay peacefully in her case. She looked as if she were only asleep, for she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that a king's son rode through the forest, and came to the dwarf's house for the night. He soon saw the glass case upon the rock and the beautiful girl lying in it, and he read also the golden letters. When he had examined it, he said to the dwarfs,
Let me have this case, and I will pay what you ask for it.
But the dwarfs replied, We will not sell it for all the gold in the world. The prince said, Then give it to me, for I cannot live without Snow White. I will protect her as long as I live. At last, however, the dwarfs pitied him, and gave him the case. The prince ordered it to be carried away on the shoulders of his attendants. Now it happened that they stumbled over a stone, and with the shock, the piece of poisoned apple fell out of her mouth. Very soon she opened her eyes, and, raising the lid of the glass case, she rose up and asked,
Where am I?
Full of joy, the prince answered, You are now safe with me, and telling all that had happened, he said, Come with me to my father's castle and you shall be my bride. Snow White was glad and went with him. And soon everything was got ready for a splendid wedding. But the old stepmother of Snow White was also invited to the wedding, and when she was dressed in beautiful clothes to go, she first went to her mirror, and asked,
Tell me, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?
Then it replied,
Queen, you were the fairest yesterday, but the prince's bride is fair today.
Hearing this, the old queen got so angry that she did not know what to do with herself. But she was so full of envy and curiosity that she could not help going out to see the young queen, and as soon as she saw her, she found that she was Snow White herself, and with anger and astonishment she stood as if rooted to the ground.
Thank you for listening.
And with anger and astonishment she stood as if rooted to the ground.
Thank you for listening.